So I'll now give you an overview on the structure of the work we are doing on developing global guidelines on this issue. And first of all, as Simon Stewart and Cathy McKinnon said at the beginning, this was an initiative launched jointly by the two largest commission of IUCN. The guidelines will be one issue in the series of best practice, that is the WCPA series for assisting protected areas in enhancing their activities. The messages that we have stressed in structuring the work is that protected areas can play a major role in managing invaders to protect global biodiversity, but the idea is that we need to focus on all the different aspects that are relevant for this work. So the best practice guideline that we are going to develop, as I said, is part of a set of similar best practices. Several have been launched here at the WPC or are planned to be developed in the next future. Many volumes have already been published. We made reference to, for example, to ecological restoration for protected areas that has in several aspects similar approaches to what we plan to do for invasive species. The target in general are park managers that can go from decision makers at a higher level to practitioners and rangers. The structure of these volumes is more or less quite defined. There is a chapter on how to use guiding through the volumes. We plan to have a chapter on the key concepts behind the work on invasive species in protected areas. We will then draft principles and guidelines, and these are the terms that are usually used in these volumes. We are going to collect best practices that are quite detailed examples on how to deal with invasive alien species. We also plan to include a chapter on defining a management plan on invasive species. We plan to compile case studies and then to add references and other useful resources. As I say, this is the structure of another volume that we can use as a model, and you see a principle in ecological restoration can be, this is just an example, be effective in reestablishing and maintaining protected areas values. And one guideline could be, again, as an example, do not harm, by first identifying when active restoration is the best option, or, for example, reestablish ecosystem structure, function, and composition. This is just to give you a kind of an example, a flavor of how the work could be structured. And again, this is taken from the ecological restoration volume, and it is on the control of invasive alien species. I don't think you can read it, but just to tell you that there could be very brief examples. Many of the case studies that we heard today could become examples or best practices or case studies for a volume of this series. Some of the examples are really very brief, but provide an input to for the readers. So what are the key concepts that we are elaborating? First of all, that invasive species affect biodiversity and also ecosystem services that are crucial for our livelihood. This is an important message that is becoming more and more relevant. It is not only biodiversity, but we are preserving biodiversity, we are also preserving humans' life and health, for example. Biodiversity and health is one of the areas of activity where the CPD is now increasing its attention. Impacts are expected to grow in the future. We know that climate change, for example, can worsen the impact of invasive species, at least in some regions. And of course there will be a political basis, so which the set of decisions behind the work on invasive species, and you heard about them earlier on in the session. Again, key concept, it is urgent to improve the management of invasive species. In several presentations it was said that Target 11 is not only about enlarging the surface of protected areas, but also on improving the efficacy of management. It's also important probably to stress that letting nature take its course does not apply to invasive species. This is somehow a common approach in protected areas. We are just protecting natural evolutionary trajectories. It doesn't work with invasive species. Sometimes you have to be very active in intervening, and that's not always the example on the regulations on toxics, and the herbicide is one example. In this case, we often have to be much more active than on other threats. Again, it has been said several times, but protected areas is not only the role of protected areas is not only, it shouldn't be only on active management of invasive species, but it should be also on monitoring, raising awareness at all levels, from their internal staff to the broader public, improving the capacity of practitioners to deal with invaders, developing innovative solutions, implementing site-based prevention efforts, because we all know that prevention is better than response whenever possible. It was mentioned for the World Heritage Site. Biosecurity policy at the island level are crucial for protected areas on islands. Enforcing early detection and rapid response, and being also catalyst of action beyond the protected area boundary. So many of the elements that came out from the discussion of today as well. We also want to stress one element that is not the priority, but it's important to keep in mind. Protected areas provide a valuable source of information. We need to use that to also encourage research, because we need to understand better the patterns of invasion. And we also have protected areas very often have a greater knowledge that can help improving action also in other contexts. So it's important that protected areas continue to play a role in terms of developing better systems to a better understanding of biological invasions. Of course, one key concept is that protected areas cannot stop invasions. This is not the solution globally, but can be a crucial actor in preventing and mitigating the global effects of invasive species. Nick Holmes before presented how much biodiversity and how many species that are threatened by invasive species are hosted by protected areas, so this is a crucial element. But they can also be sentinels for speeding up action and detecting early new incursions. They can be champions for increasing information and awareness, and they can be catalysts of action, as in the case of the involvement of the communities and for action at all scales. So these are the four draft principles that we have in the kind of wording used in this series that we have elaborated so far. So protected areas as barriers and sentinels against invasive species. This is somehow the reactive approach, but also catalysts of action at all levels. Laboratories for developing solutions and for increasing the amount of information that we have and that is crucial for improving, for enhancing better response, and champions for increasing information and awareness within the different sectors of the society. So these are the four principles that we have so far elaborated, and these principles will be then linked to guidelines, for example, regarding the barriers and sentinels, enforce surveillance, integrate invasive species in the broader planning of the protected area, set priorities. Priority setting is a crucial element, has been formally included in the target 9. We cannot work on all invasive species. We need to set, to identify which are the most relevant and the first ones we should focus on. Implement prevention whenever possible. In many areas we have protected areas, for example in urban context, can be an entry point for invasive species. So we need to be focusing also on prevention, not only on response. Develop and enforce appropriate and effective plans for managing priority invasive species. The example that we have on islands is crucial. We need to learn from the experiences, and then detect rapidly new incursions and set up prompt response frameworks. So for each of the principles, we are going to elaborate guidelines. And for example, when we talk of being catalyst of action at all levels, the first point is engage with local communities. We heard it very effectively today, all the many successful examples of engagement, but at the same time, the key element that we have to address, because in some cases, like in the Lord Howe example, the lack of support is a major limit for a very important project. Act as a science hub, develop science-based management solutions. So these are a list of guidelines that we need to elaborate further for each principle. We are going to have we plan to have one chapter on how to elaborate a management plan for an invasive species within a protected area. And we need to compile a set of detailed case studies. For example, the management of invasive species in the Kruger National Park could be one example, but these case studies should be representative of the different contexts of the world and of the ecological context. The examples, because these volumes are not very lengthy in text, but have a lot of examples. They can go from boxes, quite detailed examples, to very brief text, as I said. So I really encourage you all to stay in contact with us and to exchange ideas on which are the most effective examples that could guide action of protected areas. So what we plan to do is to work on the ideas that that were circulated during the entire World Park Congress. One very frustrating element for me is that invasive species appear everywhere. So in every presentation, or many presentations that I heard, or the presentations on the World Heritage Outlook, or in many other contexts, invasive species are mentioned. But if you look at for example, the initial plenaries, nobody mentions invasive species in the higher policy context. This is probably our fault. I mean, we try to bridge the gap between science and decision making, but unfortunately, even if invasive species are so high in the priority of action perceived by the park community, they are very low in the attention by the policy level. I can say, even if Braulio is very supportive, still we lack support at that level. And I really hope that in the promise of Sydney we will manage to incorporate some wording on invasive species. At the moment there is nothing on it. We want to elaborate also the inputs from the discussion during this session, so the examples and the comments that we can have afterwards. Especially on the outline, so the structure of the work that we have so far elaborated, and then what we will need help also for compiling best practices, so examples of any kind that could provide a more practical lessons on how to deal with the different aspects of invasive species. And also a selection of case studies that are more detailed. Usually they don't go over 20 case studies in this kind of volume, so we will need to carefully select which are the most informative on this area. So this is just to give you an overview of the entire structure of the of the principles and guidelines. I know we have very little time now, but if you have comments, input, suggestions, please, we are in an early stage of the work. We really would like to have more people involved. We are very open to share ideas, to change what we've done so far. If you see that if we lack some key concept, we are open to discuss with you. So that's more or less the overview, and I thank you all for the time you've been listening, and I really hope we have in these few minutes the time for starting a discussion that we would like to continue in the next year or so. Thank you.